Hello, everyone. It is 4 o'clock, or it is 1 o'clock, so we're going to go ahead and get started here with our webinar. My name is Emily Fusco, and I am the coordinator for the Northwest Regional Invasive Species and Climate Change Network. We're really excited today to have you all here at our winter webinar about horticulture in a changing climate and making garden decisions that prevent plant invasions. Before we really jump in here with our speakers, I want to direct your attention to the toolbar here on Zoom. So we're going to be using the chat feature for questions. You can enter questions into the chat at any time during the talks. And then at the end of each talk, we'll spend some time answering the questions that come in. And then at the end, we'll yes, if we have some time, we can go back to questions or spend a little bit more time on questions at the very end as well. We have two speakers with us today. We're going to start. Oh, also during the webinar, if you see or hear things that you're really excited about, feel free to use your reactions button. You can give thumbs up and hearts and like things and all that to let your speakers know that you're liking what you're hearing. And that's also in your Zoom toolbar. So we are going to, all right, perfect. Somebody's got it. So we're going to go get started here. Our first speaker today is Eve Fury. Eve is a postdoctoral researcher at Princeton University, and I am going to stop sharing my screen, and Eve can go ahead and take over from here.
Yeah, hi everybody. I'll just maybe leave my face up for a second. Always kind of weird on these Zoom webinars. I'm just talking to myself alone in my room. So yeah, my name is Eve. I'm currently a postdoc at Princeton University working on climate mitigation and adaptation, but I did my PhD at the University of Massachusetts Amherst with the spatial ecology group that started the Northeast Risk, and I think inspired a lot of the cool things going on in the Northwest as well. And so I'm excited to be here and talk about some of the research we've done on trying to understand the effect that horticulture has on spreading invasive species, both now and with climate change. And so I'm going to talk about two different projects that were largely a collaborative effort with other members of the leadership team that's based in the Northeast. And so, yeah, like I said, I'm going to talk about two different things and really the whole sort of impetus of this research and all of the projects that we're trying to do under this umbrella are trying to understand how we can prevent the spread of invasive species and introductions of invasive species. And if we want to be preventing spread and introductions, horticulture is really a place that we need to be working with because, as I'm sure many of you know, horticulture is one of the primary introduction pathways for non-native invasive species into the United States. And so just to sort of put some numbers behind that, this is from a paper that's a little bit old now, but I think is still really compelling. They identified the introduction pathways for about 1,000 species that are considered invasive in the United States. They weren't able to identify the original introduction pathway for about 30% of those species. About 10% of the species were accidental introductions, so things like seed contaminants or stowaways on shipments of products. But 60%, so the vast majority here of our invasive plants were introduced intentionally. And the bulk of those intentional introductions are imports of non-native species through the plant nursery trade. So horticultural industry bringing in non-native plants, those species then escape cultivation and spread in natural areas, and then we call them invasive. And so again, if we want to be thinking about preventing invasive species introductions and spread, horticulture and the plant nursery industry is really the single pathway that we can, we should be focusing a lot of our attention. So how do we actually reduce introductions and spread from horticulture? Well, first, if we want to do that, we need to have a really strong understanding of what species are still in trade and sort of where they're spreading. And so for this set of projects, that's exactly what we were trying to understand. We first wanted to know which invasive plants are still being sold as ornamentals versus species that maybe we've had some success at taking them off the market. Where do these sales actually occur across the United States? Are there maybe some states or regions where we're doing a better job managing trade versus areas where there's a lot of room for improvement? And then how do these sales actually compare to where species invade, both now and with climate change? And I'll talk a little bit more about what this question is relevant in particular. And then lastly, what policy and outreach measures or mechanisms can help reduce invasion risk? And we've done a ton of research into this question number 4, but just for sake of time, I'm going to focus on the research that we've done at these first 3 questions. And then hopefully if there's some time, I can talk about the project that Emily and I did trying to understand the sort of different policy mechanisms for managing invasive plants across the United States. Okay, so jumping right in, which invasive plants are still sold as ornamentals? To figure this out, we first needed to come up with a list of species that are considered invasive in the lower 48 United States. And so we came up with a list of about 1,300 different species. This is from a combination of the Federal Noxious Weed List, individual state prohibited plant lists, and then the Invasive Plant Atlas, which is a website of sort of user or expert reported records of invasives. So things that may not necessarily be captured on prohibited plant lists were reported in the Invasive Plant Atlas. And then to figure out which plants are still sold as ornamentals, we basically did a bunch of Googling. I had an undergraduate student, several undergraduate students spend a couple of years conducting standardized Google searches and going through databases of catalogs so we could find out how many websites are actually selling invasive species and how many species are actively spread through commercial trade. And so I just put some screen captures up here to give you an example. On the left, you can see one of those standardized searches for miscanthus, which is an invasive grass that's fire prone in the Midwestern and Southeastern United States. So that's sort of what the search looked like. And on the right is a screen capture where you can see the species is sold by a commercial nursery. And so we recorded a bunch of information about those nursery sales, where the nursery is located, and whether or not they put any restrictions on the species, such as whether or not the species might be likely to be invasive. Or, you can see here, if you can squint a little bit, that there's some shipping restrictions for this. So you're not allowed to ship this to Alaska, California, Hawaii. And so we recorded all this information for all these different species to try to figure out sort of what the landscape looks like for what invasive species are still actively being promoted through the gardening industry. Okay, so of the 1,285 species we looked for, 501 of these species were not for sale, as far as we could tell from our internet searches and databases of nursery catalogs, but 784 species were for sale. And so more than half here, 61% of the invasive plants that are known to be invasive in the United States are still commercially distributed through the gardening industry. And that's just the reality is none of these should be for sale. And so the fact that we're seeing more than half are still promoted through the gardening industry is really troubling. Somewhat even more troubling is that within this group of 784, 340 of these species are state prohibited. And so, several hundred species are considered prohibited by different state governments in the United States. And 20 of these species are federally regulated noxious weeds. So we only have about 100 species on our federal noxious weed list, and 20 of those are still being sold at least somewhere in the United States through the gardening industry. And so really, this is a hugely pervasive problem. There's tons of species that are still being circulated through trade, even though we have sort of growing evidence of their ability to escape cultivation and impact native ecosystems. So where do these ornamental sales occur? This map on the left is showing you the location of all of the nurseries we found selling invasive species. And so, no brainer here, the take home is that it's happening everywhere. Every state in the lower 48 United States has a nursery that's selling at least one invasive species. You can see there's some spatial variation in the number of species that are for sale, but some of the big nurseries here and seed distributors are selling up to 60, 100, or even more invasive species from a single location. And so again, this is just to say that this is a hugely pervasive problem, and this is occurring throughout the United States. One of the interesting things we found is that the database was sort of split between retail and wholesale nurseries that have, like, in that picture shows like an on-the-ground location where you can go and buy plants on the spot, and then online trade that is mail order nurseries or individuals who are selling plants on things like eBay or Amazon or eCrater and things like that. So the majority of what we found is still coming in and out of a retail or wholesale nursery that has, a point location or a garden center where you can go buy species on the spot. And then a smaller proportion of that is online trade only. And so this is just to say that I think the online marketplace for plants is something we need to keep our eye on. It's definitely growing, and they have the potential to ship plants over large distances, which I'll show you in a couple of slides. But still, a lot of this traffic or this commercial trade is happening from nurseries that have a true garden center that should be undergoing a nursery inspection. And so there's a lot of work we need to do to consider ornamental trade online, but also to be thinking more seriously and about enforcing regulations on the ground. Okay, so this is the project I really wanted to talk to. This is something that came out a couple of months ago in the summer that sort of built or added some layers to this data set of what species are for sale and where is this happening. Now we actually want to know how the sales compare to where species invade, both now and with climate change. And there's two reasons why this is really important. The first reason is just the sort of scope of this can help us understand at what scale we need to be regulating trade and how we can prioritize risk. And basically what I mean by that is if something is being sold in Florida, but it's only considered invasive in Oregon, maybe that's not something we really worry about so much. Whereas if these sales are sort of on top of the locations where we know species can invade, then that's a much bigger problem. And then the other reason this is really important is because invasive species are on the move both now, and this is really where climate change becomes really key. Invasive species are shifting their ranges with climate change. And there's a potential that horticulture could be facilitating that movement very quickly if we're selling species in places that might not be invasive now, but that could change in the future. And so just to give you some evidence for that, this is a project that actually just came out in the last couple of weeks in diversity and distributions that's led by my colleague Annette Evans. She ran species distribution models for 144 invasive plants in the United States and then focused directly on the areas that are the highest risk of invasion from each one of these species. And so the map on the right is from that project. It's showing you hotspots of invasion both now under current climate on the left side and then under future climate on the right side. And so you can see that the hotspots are largely in agreement, but there is some shift in this invasion risk. And those dark red areas, there's invasion risk for up to 40 different invasive species. And so that's something that's really scary. Invasive species are definitely on the move. And in general, one of the big take-homes from this paper is that even species that are maybe, shrinking in range or expanding range, across the board, pretty much all of the species we looked at are going to have suitable habitat in new areas with climate change. So even species that might face overall range contractions, they're still on the move with climate change. And so, if you're in an area where there's increasing risk, that's something you really need to be aware of. And again, we want to make sure that horticulture is not, unwittingly facilitating the spread of these species, especially because we have tools like this that can help us forecast that invasion risk. And I just wanted to do a quick plug that obviously this map is for the eastern United States, but we ran models for all species across the United States, and we're working on a follow-up paper to look at hotspots in the western US right now. And so I wouldn't be surprised if you see a very similar pattern for the Pacific Northwest, where you're seeing this kind of northern shift of species into your region. There's also some interesting, I think, reciprocal transport between the Pacific Northwest and the Northeast. And so lots of sort of continental scale movement that we need to be considering. Okay, so we want to know how nursery sales compare to where species actually invade, both now and with climate change. To answer this big question, we narrowed our scope and focused on 89 of the ornamental invasive plants that we know are actively moved through trade. And each one of these species has good enough distribution data for us to actually map invasion risk. And so for this subset of species, we compared each one of the nursery locations where species are commercially available to species invaded locations. And so these are abundance records where species have been reported at least 5 or 10% cover in a natural area. So how far are nurseries to actually locations where we've observed species spreading? How far are nurseries from the potential range of invasive species under current climate? So is there potential that nurseries are already facilitating range and filling of invasive species? And then how do nursery locations compare to species ranges under future climate? So that question of range shifts and whether nurseries are facilitating that range shift. And I just want to set the stage for this a little bit. As part of this project, we were also just curious, how big is the nursery industry? How far are nurseries selling plants on average? Like, is a cross-continental thing something we really need to worry about, or is this really a local issue? And so to do this, we use this website called Dave's Garden, and I'll be happy to talk about the methods for this if anybody's curious, but for now I'm going to keep it short and just talk about the plot. And so this is the distance a plant travels from where it's purchased compared between nurseries that specialize in retail sales on the left and then nurseries that specialize in mail order sales. And so for retail nurseries, the median distance there is 21 kilometers. And so, about half of their commerce is within the same town or the same county as where the nursery is actually located. But for mail order nurseries, the median distance is 1,000 kilometers. And so that's like, the distance of a couple of states or within the same region, but that's a big distance. So more than half their commerce is less than that. But that's sort of the median distance, which suggests already the horticultural industry is moving plants across long distance. And these mail order nurseries have the potential to introduce invasive species even from completely different ecoregions or states or, continental divides. And so already we have the sense that, this is a big problem and a broad geographic scope that we need to be thinking about. Okay, but really that was kind of an exercise to test and try to get a sense for what a meaningful distance is. So we're going to use these median distances of 21 kilometers and 1,000 kilometers to basically set an expectation for how far we think nurseries distribute plants, and then use that expectation to draw comparisons to invaded locations. And so next, we compared the distance between each nursery selling an invasive species and the nearest location where that species is invasive. These distances varied a lot. So the shortest distance was about less than a kilometer. So the invasion is, basically down the road from the nursery. And then the maximum distance is 4,000 kilometers. And so, that's like the full distance of the United States. And so completely different geographies going on. And so, a lot of variation in terms of how close nurseries actually are to invasions. But something really interesting is that more than half of the species we looked at are sold by a nursery within 21 kilometers of an invasion, and almost all the species we looked at are sold by a nursery within 1,000 kilometers of an invasion. And so, you know, ranging from short to very long distances, but for pretty much all species, we have some evidence that horticulture could contribute propagular pressure for these invasions. And so, again, this is kind of a crazy way to think about this, but like and I've heard some partners in nursery trade argue that like, oh, it's not us, it's not escaping our lot, we're not the ones causing the problem. But now we have some pretty clear evidence that like this is not, this can be a big problem, but it's also a local issue. Like these invasions are right down the street from nurseries, and we really need to be doing a better job making sure that these escapes aren't happening. Okay, so that's based on species, actual locations where we have data where they invaded, but of course, we don't have a data point about every single place where the species is invasive. Where the species is invasive, many of the invasive species we have in the United States are still expanding already under current climate change. And so for the next set of analyses, we wanted to compare nursery locations to the projected ranges for where we think species could be invasive under current climate change. And so this is what this looks like. All the blue points there are nurseries selling each one of these species. And then the shaded red locations are the range where those species could potentially become highly abundant under current climate. And this is a very simplified range map, but basically we focus on the highest risk areas within, the sort of continuous output of the distribution model. So that's also something I'd be happy to talk about later if you're curious. But the take home here is that at least for these 4 examples, you can see a huge overlap, right? There's tons of nurseries within the locations where we know these species are invasive. There's some instances where we might not worry so much. So like, for example, if you look at calorie pair, these nurseries that are selling the species are completely separate from the range of habitats where we know it's invasive. But at the same time, you have a huge density of nurseries that are completely overlapping with the species range. And this was true for most species we looked at. So 82% of the species in our data set had at least one nursery within its potential invaded range. About a third of the species have more than 10 nurseries within their potential range, and there were 3 species that have more than 50 nurseries in their range. And so again, we have pretty compelling evidence that horticulture could facilitate range infilling for most of the species we looked at, which is a pretty good sample of a lot of the ornamental invasives we have. Okay, so that's what's going on under current climate. Now let's fill in what's going on with climate change for these 4 example species. So all of the areas in light red are high risk of range expansion with climate change. And again, those blue points are all the nurseries. And so for these 4 cases, you can see that there are a handful of nurseries that are either right on the margins of the range or are already in the locations where the species could be expanding with climate change. And so again, maybe you could make an argument that like, hey, we're not selling it where it's known to spread now, but in a couple of years that could really change. And so we need to start thinking ahead about how we can reduce the risk from these types of introductions. And across the data set, we found that about a third of the species we looked at had at least one nursery in its future suitable range. And so for target species, horticulture could be facilitating range expansion. And I think this is really important because it is a much smaller list of species that have this risk of expansion with climate change. But that's actually a really promising result, I think, because it gives us a very targeted list of species that we can do outreach for right now and say like, look, hey, this hasn't spread yet, but there's a high risk that it could. Can we try to get that off the market before it causes a huge problem in an area with climate change? And so I think this is, we have a really targeted way to move forward in terms of a smaller number of species that have this high risk of expanding with climate change. And I'll just say again, these are, I think, very conservative predictions of range maps. And so even this is a pretty conservative take on what could be going on. Okay, so I flew through that, but I think I'm coming up on the 20-minute mark. So let's just wrap up quickly to revisit our broad questions. Which invasive plants are still sold as ornamentals? Well, more than half are commercially available through the gardening industry. These sales are occurring pretty much everywhere across the United States. And we have pretty strong evidence that many species are sold within their invaded range. And so there might be some instances where the nursery is in a completely different location or environment from where the species could actually spread. But for most species, that's not actually the case. We have some evidence that propagular pressure could contribute to ongoing invasions under current climate, and then for a smaller list of species that have a high risk of spreading with climate change. And so this is something we have a lot of room for opportunity to doing a better job at regulating both now and in the future. And so I said I wasn't going to talk about policy and outreach, but I will just say that I think the 2 broader take homes from those specific results is that, and something that Emily and I have done some research on, is that really what I think this says is that we need better coordinated and broader policy regulation. So those state by state lists are only really capturing what's going on within your state borders, but clearly this is a much bigger issue. If you have a seed distributor in New York that's shipping seeds all over the place, that's not something that's currently regulated in our policy framework that we have in the United States right now, and something that maybe should be. And so we need to be thinking broader about how we're regulating trade, especially as the online marketplace for plants has really grown. And that data was all collected prior to COVID. And so I wouldn't be surprised if more people than ever are buying and shipping plants across long distances using things like Amazon and eBay. And then the second point I want to make is just that I think encouraging native plant gardening is really huge here. Not only do native plants have more ecological benefits, they support wildlife, they support pollinators, they're not causing invasions. But well, I guess that's the big thing. So they're supporting all these wildlife, but they're not causing invasions, like there's a much lower risk of becoming invasive if you're native to a region than if you're non-native to the region. And so encouraging native gardening is a huge way I think that we need to concentrate our efforts to try to reduce invasion risk. I see that there's still like a big disconnect in people's understanding of how many plants at their garden centers are native, non-native, invasive. And so this is something I think that all of us in the room could probably do a better job spreading the word about. And so in the Northeast, we've come up with a bunch of resources to try to help people make decisions about what to plant in their yard. For example, we have come up with a list of climate smart native plants, and this is a resource that we're updating right now. So trying to think about what plants are already native to our region and might persist with climate change. And then the reciprocal of that is the species that we shouldn't be selling because we don't want them to come into our region with climate change. So for example, this management challenge in the middle are species that are not yet in the Northeast United States as far as we're aware. They're popular in trade further south. And so we really want to be working with industry partners to say like, hey, you're not making money off of this yet. Please don't bring it here because there's a huge risk of this spreading into our natural areas. And we have this major opportunity to be proactive. So we really need to be doing everything that we can to prevent those invasions. And so I think these are resources that are Northeast specific, but lend insights to what we can think about in other regions and are definitely reproducible for other regions. And so I'm curious to hear what Linda has to say. And with that, I'll just thank you. I think most of the things on this slide are things that you'll get information about or you already have information about through the RISC listserv. I'll just do a quick shout out that there's an international symposium on invasions and climate change that's happening January 30th and 31st. It's virtual, it's free. I just saw the speaker list today and it looks incredible. And it's a really sort of diverse set of perspectives from different places and different practitioners. And so I highly encourage everybody to register for that. And I know I talked really fast, but I hope you got it all. So thank you.
Thanks, Eve, so much. That was fantastic. Everyone, please remember you can add questions to the chat. We are going to take a few minutes here to ask Eve some questions, and then we will move on to our next speaker. So first, Eve, there was a request for the website for the Invasive Plant Atlas. So if you could drop that in the chat, I think that would be appreciated. The next question here, so for plant searches, were you looking at specific cultivars or species level only? Because some cultivars may be considered less invasive for a species than other cultivars.
That's a great question. And unfortunately, given the huge sample size, we didn't look at varieties and cultivars, but we did for a little bit of a case study. So for example, one of the federal noxious weeds we found for sale is Imparatus cylindrica or Kogan grass. And so that's something that a lot of plant breeders have tried to breed sterile cultivars for. I've been learning a lot about this in the last couple of months about, sterile cultivars aren't really sterile or like non-invasive varieties actually may not be invasive. I think that there's not enough research happening about that, but there are a few studies that are very compelling in terms of the cultivated variety can regain invasive traits after a couple generations. And what it takes to be called sterile is like, yeah, I heard people describe it as like seedless, which basically means you have less seed, not that you're seedless. And so I think there's some trade, loopholes that a lot of these sterile cultivars are still, potentially a risk. And so if we have opportunities to grow things that, there's no potential invasion, it just seems like a no-brainer to focus on that rather than the sterile or like the supposedly sterile or seedless varieties. So not a part of this data effort, but something I think is really interesting and that we're learning more about regularly.
Great, thanks, Eve. Another question here. So, has there been any similar analysis done for existing range and potential expansion through nursery sales or other forms of assisted migration in Canada? So, looking for a more North
Mm.
America-wide perspective. And this person also commented that they're surprised that there's a market for some of these species, like bittersweet or Queen Anne's lace, because here in British Columbia, both are quite prevalent in natural areas and disturbed pre-development areas, especially in urban and peri-urban areas.
Yeah, great question. I know it's a real shame that the border is always cut off at Mexico and the United States. I think like same thing if we had the species from Mexico like, and the Caribbean that could shift into the southern United States, that map might look a little bit different. So no, I don't know of anything, but it's something we've heard from the Northeast Network over and over that like we need these kinds of models for Canada. And so yeah, that I think that's like a top priority for things that we're thinking about for moving forward. But I wouldn't be surprised if you see that big red chunk of the Northeast United States, like, that's going this way. And so I feel like a lot of the parallels and lists that we have for the United States are highly relevant for Canada, whether or not we have the spatially explicit predictions. Yeah, so that's a great point. And like I heard that call and we need to solve that. Yeah, it is kind of shocking there's a market, right? I mean, kudzu was originally imported to the United States in 1917 as this beautiful exotic curling vine, and like, look what happened. So, that's one that's like not actively in trade anymore because I think it's become pretty well established that it's not out there. But like, I don't know if you saw on my eBay slide, like, it's bittersweet. Like, people went out and got the seeds from their backyard and ship them to somebody. So like it's kind like the lack of awareness is pretty striking, even for species that you think are like sort of weedy and gross and like why would you ever buy this? People are buying it. And so yeah, it's kind of shocking. I just heard a talk by a nursery broker who showed some of the money that people make from things like burning bush and bittersweet and barberry, and it's staggering. It's in the tens of millions of dollars just because they're so easy to propagate, which is why they're so good at spreading in natural areas. And it's just like, it's something that I feel like there's still a huge disconnect on, even for species that are like the obvious, weedy, undesirable things.
All right, next question here. So, a request for the list of native plants he mentioned in the context of climate change.
Yes. Yeah, I'm seeing a thing like I'll make sure that when I post things in the chat, they actually go to everybody in the chat. Um,
Yeah, to send to everyone as opposed to just the hosts and the panelists.
Yeah. And I can make sure that so all of that is on the like risk landing page if you go to the Northeast and then the management challenges. I can make sure, Emily, that you have like maybe there's a set of PDFs we can send as a follow-up to the webinar. But yeah, that's all
Okay.
publicly available on the Northeast Risk website. So happy to share those lists. And like I said, we're doing like an overhaul of that right now to try to also expand it to include ornamental plants and restoration candidates that are climate resilient. So stay
Mhm.
tuned, but happy to share.
All right. So another question, looking for your opinion on state regulations of invasive species and whether you think the species should be sold, I guess, like if they can be sold outside the state or like if they shouldn't be sold at all.
Yeah, so just to give sort of an overview, the federal noxious weed list, the main point of that is the sort of international border. And then in theory, it's supposed to prevent cross-state border movement, but nobody's actually enforcing that list. And so the state lists are only within state borders. I don't, as far as I know, there's not really any enforcement going on across state borders. And so it is sort of up to each state how they want to navigate that. I've talked to a few states like New York who are sort of actively thinking about like what's going on in our state and like what nurseries in our state could be shipping across state borders. And then also vice versa. I think Washington had people that were working with Amazon to try to flag stuff from coming into Washington at some point. I don't know what the update on that is, but um, yeah, I think the big take home there is that the lists work to some degree within the state at reducing, like if you're on a state list, there's a good chance you're not sold by a nursery within the state. That's not always true, but it's often true. But the lists themselves are very fraught. They're, largely inconsistent. They're often short and political and hard to change and not very proactive. And so Emily and I have a set of research that sort of dug into all the issues with the list themselves. And I think it's actually stimulated a lot of positive change in the United States. People are thinking more thoughtfully about how the list could be used in ways that they may not be already. And so, yeah, I think if it's on the list, it should not be sold. I think there's too many exemptions. again, I think that I have a strong stance on this, but that seedless idea, like that, there's just so much opportunity to be doing a better job at this. And I think there's a lot of opportunity to have positive relationships with nursery trade. I think there's a lot of fear that adding something to a regulatory list is going to make it harder for people to make money and operate their businesses. But I've actually heard the opposite, that if you add things to a regulatory list, it makes nurseries have an easier time doing their due diligence, and they're not worried about their neighbor down the street selling an invasive because everybody's sort of abiding by the same rules. And so the people that want to do well by the environment, want to encourage native plant gardening, having stronger regulations helps them a lot. And that's something I think is really exciting, and I'm hearing more and more of. And so I think there's a lot of positive energy and momentum, but we've got a lot of work to do to make this sort of industry and the regulatory landscape and the science work better together. So
Great,
that's
thanks,
my
Eve. So
soapbox.
yeah, so we're gonna move on. There is one other question in the chat. Maybe you can answer in the chat. So a question about uh, how often you think plants or seeds are mislabeled, and if this could be a complication of kind of what you're talking about here. And if you also get a chance to post a link to the registration for the international conference as well. And while you're doing that, I'm going to go ahead and introduce our next speaker. So our next speaker is Linda Hardison, coming to us from Oregon State University. And Linda is the director of Oregon Flora. And I am going to turn it over to Linda for this next presentation here.
Okay, thank you very much for having me participate in your seminar series. So I think Eve set it up very well for me to talk about some of the work that we do at Oregon Flora and its relevance in this sphere. As Oregon Flora, we are gathering information about the plants of our state, and that takes the form of the vascular plants of the state of Oregon. And with all of its different ecoregions, it's a pretty diverse state. And here's just some broad numbers that show you that we have a great deal of plant diversity, over 4,700 different taxa, that is species, subspecies, or varieties of plants within the state. And what our goal is to keep track of all of these to help broad audiences understand these plants, the plant diversity, their context, and make this information really usable. And so that other big number you see, over 10,000, is the number of scientific names in our database, because taxonomy can vary between regions or between references, and the science is always moving forward. There's a lot of synonymy in names, and so we keep track of these so people in different contexts can understand which plant concept which taxonomic concept they're talking about. And one real common example of that is in the horticultural nursery often refers to Oregon grape as Mahonia, the genus Mahonia, whereas our research indicates that our preferred and accepted scientific name for that is Berberis. So throughout all of our resources, you can always do this cross-referencing of names to identify the plant that you're actually both talking about, no matter what name you want to call it. Oops. So why does one need a flora? Well, first of all, a flora is a comprehensive work about the plants of a region. As I've described, this is the vascular plants of the state of Oregon. And it's really the source of information for anything botanical or anything that relates to a lot of biodiversity. And its first job is to sort of assess the diversity of plants within a region, and then give you all the basic information about that. And this is really critical. I think the most critical resource that we provide, or the group that we serve, is land managers. So imagine this is anybody from the federal agencies who collectively own over half of the acreage in our state, to gardeners. You're both land managers, whether you're managing 1 million acres or 1/20th of an acre. and having a good understanding of plants, the habitats, their characteristics, their growth habits, what they fit in with as a plant community or in an ecoregion is really helpful to being successful in your stewardship of your land. Also, the major role of floras historically has been to help you identify unknown plants. And again, we provide context. All of this information together gives users a context for how they relate to plants as human beings. Our flora takes the form of printed books. We have 2 of our 3 volumes published now. We're working to finish volume 3 of the Flora of Oregon within the next 12 to 15 months. This printed work represents the first flora for our state since 1961. So that's a long time to not have accurate and up-to-date information about plant diversity. For those of you who may not be as familiar with what a flora is, when you open up the book, this is what you see. So you're going to see detailed examples of all of the plants of each individual plant taxon, whether it's a subspecies or a full species. We also have genus and plant family descriptions. So you go up the taxonomic hierarchy. We have little thumbnail maps that demonstrate the distribution of that taxon, as well as shaded areas that show what ecoregion it's in, because that's a lens that we use a lot to help talk about the plants of our state. There are these dichotomous identification keys and illustrations, something that 1961 flora did not have. And so these are really helpful visual tools to help you understand and identify plants. Within the descriptions of each plant and each taxon include things such as the habitats, the ecoregions in which it occurs, and other geographic features such as elevation ranges and phenology. So I mentioned ecoregions because that's a really useful lens through which to view plant communities and plant diversity. Oregon recognizes 11 different ecoregions that largely follow the EPA level 3. And these are similar to probably some of the types of habitats and ecoregions that also exist in Washington state. We have everything from the coast to the east side of the Cascade Mountain Range, where you have these beautiful, big, tall ponderosa pines. We also have the Willamette Valley. Much of that habitat has been degraded or destroyed through agriculture and population increases, but is largely recognized as oak savanna, open prairies, and river valley material. We also have in the eastern portion of our state, the Blue and Wallowa Mountains has a really different set of abiologic characters, and consequently the plant diversity is often different from what you find on the western side of the Cascades. And in between all that nice central Oregon flat sort of high desert area includes the basin and range areas. And then over in the lower left corner, some examples of the beautiful alpine meadows that are common in our volcanic Cascade Mountain Range. So through all of this, when you consider the huge amount of diversity biologically and abiologically that exist in Oregon, one of our jobs as being sort of a steward of plant information is to make this information usable and useful to all different kinds of people who could use some knowledge about our natural resources. So what I'm going to do right now is change and take you on a little bit of a live website tour. So this is our website, OregonFlora.org. And as we're talking about the horticultural industry and nurseries and their role as a vector for sort of spreading and working with invasive species, one of the tools that Oregon Flora has developed is looking at how natives can be used in gardening and landscaping settings. And so that's through our Grow Natives tool. And what you'll see here is that we are featuring 300 different taxa from across the state that have that are used commercially. That is, they're sold either through wholesale or retail outlets in general, as we're tracking that information. And of these, we've created in our data set information relevant to, you know, the propagation and growing of these. So this is a tool that lets users search for something that they're interested in that would be relevant to the kind of place and setting that they're looking to plant their native species. And any number of these characters can be selected. So you can choose from plant needs, whether it has, you know, red flowers or pink flowers, what kind of landscape uses you might want to achieve. Say you're looking for a hedgerow type plant, as well as some basic conditions that this plant would be facing, or that it can be found in. And then through any combination, you then can go over and the list is constantly winnowing down, and you can view a profile page that's targeted towards gardening and cultivation that captures all of this information, as well as some plant groups that it would be likely to be a good partner or be part of that plant palette, and a little sort of abstract that summarizes it. We also have lots of lovely photographs of the plant, including some seed and seedling pictures, and links to our core profile page, which I'll talk about in just a second. So going back to our searches, one of the things that we have is over on the left and the bottom is this beyond the garden sort of option. And this is a place where I think you can reflect on one of the real values that a flora and a floristic context helps with in gardening and landscaping kinds of questions, which is what, if you're looking for native plants, what kind of habitat or ecoregion would that occur in the wild? Because that's really what you're trying to emulate in creating a native plant garden or a landscape. Is, you know, you're looking at the resources that that nature gives us and that exist without human intervention. And so how does our site that we're being the stewards of, what's the model system, ecosystem, or habitat that we can use as our guide for what to plant? And so it's really helpful to be able to consider some of these. And so this is taking from some of our core data and look at, you know, do I have an area that is, you know, like in my back portion of my property, it's really wet back there. So what kind of taxa would work in that sort of setting? And then you can go and use these sort of nature provided undisturbed examples as guides for how to select items on your planting. So addressing some of the things that Eve has brought up about the challenges of the nursery industry being as helpful as possible in promoting the sale of native plants. One of the tools that we're developing is looking at as truly at the commercial availability of native plant species. So I'm going to take you now to our dev site. So this isn't quite ready for prime time, but what you'll see here is that we're working with local nurseries in Oregon to take their native plant species list, you know, these vendors that say, yes, we have native plants, but we want to help people better understand about these plants. And so what better way than when you give them the context of the whole flora of the state? And so when a vendor that we partner with, they share a species list of their inventory with us, and then we are able to provide some quality control and some assistance for that, so that we're all talking the same language. And that entails having, once a list is received, we check and we say, well, nope, this is not a scientific, this is not a native species within Oregon. And this name is our preferred name, or you've got the spelling a little wrong on this. So we're providing some quality assurance for these items that a vendor is promoting, presumably for their economic benefit as well as for an ecological benefit, as native species. So in addressing a bit of the discussion that also came up about whether we're addressing species or subspecies, in this general tool of our 300 taxa that we present through the Grow Natives tool, we list things just at the species level. And that means what we did is we looked at all of the characters of plants within that species to make sure all of those character traits were expressed in our profile pages and in the searchable options. However, as we work with nurseries, you'll see what will be available is each participating vendor will have their little page where they can list all of the taxa, all of the native taxa that they sell, even if they aren't on a part of our Grow Natives tool at this time. But we also list names down to the trinomials so that you're getting the precise subspecies or variety of a plant. And this is something, again, that Oregon Flora is able to authenticate in this situation. So that is sort of our Grow Natives tool. And what I'd like to do right now is show you a little bit more of our website. So in case you are curious, or if you haven't used it, or just to remind you if you have. So OregonFlora.org, again, we are offering these tools through our website so that they're interactive. That lets us keep things absolutely up to date. One tool we have is a mapping tool, and this has this is a spatial tool that lets users either explore the diversity of an area by drawing a polygon on the map or using a circle or something, or you can drag and drop a KML file onto the map to discover all of the plants that occur there. And this is going to be coming from, on this mapping module, 1.6 million plant records. These records come from herbarium specimens throughout, certainly Oregon State University's specimens, as well as those throughout the Pacific Northwest. And we also have unvouchered observations. These are marked with a distinctive symbol so that you can distinguish between vouchered specimens and unvouchered observations, and georeferenced field photos. In total, we have over 2.1 million plant records. For each of these records, we have the information parsed out, such as the taxon, the date, the collector, and where available, other information such as phenology, habitat, associated species. So it's a really incredibly rich data set that Oregon Flora is managing and sharing through these tools. As well as looking at the plant diversity, you can also use our mapping tool to sort of discover the plant distributions by entering any single or multiple plant names with various parameters as you choose to discover those positions on the map. And of course, each dot on the map opens up a screen with all of that data I was just telling you about. Okay, another great tool is that tool might appeal more to the professional, but we also have an identify plants tool. And it's sort of like approaching the dictionary. How do you learn how to spell something if you don't know how to spell it to look it up? So we take a different approach from the dichotomous key and the more vocabulary heavy approach of our printed floras and just say, where are you in the state of Oregon? Drop a pin on the map, and then that pulls up all of the records of plants within a radius of that point that occur in our database. And from that, you can then have a small, sort of flora at your fingertips that lets you focus on just the plants that have been discovered in that region, and see then what characters you identify. Does it have opposite leaves? Does it have pink flowers? And winnow down until you get to a point where there's a small enough number that you can do some photo identification if you're at that stage. Okay, our inventories tool is sort of a head start on that, because these are different projects that we represent that give you all of the compiled information about a place. And for example, you can look at this is from our volume 1 book that lists sort of the best places to see examples of the flora. And it provides canned lists of any of these particular places. You can view these either as a list of plants. So this is a great tool if you are going hiking or want to botanize a particular area that someone else has already looked at. It's a starting place for your species list, or like a bird list or something. You can just check off what you see. This page is having a long time to load. So anyway, you can also view that as thumbnail images. And yeah, it seems to be stuck. There you go. So like this. So you can view it as thumbnail images, or you can view a full profile page of a plant. And yeah, I seem to have a slow, there we go. And this is more comprehensive. You'll notice the little green garden fact sheet button there to distinguish between the two types of profile pages that have our core pages have, the scientific description, as well as images and little maps. So inventories give you a head start on where you might be interested in exploring, and what plants lists or species lists have been already identified and created in those areas. So we've already talked about the Grow Natives tool. Oregon Flora website is the portal for the OSU herbarium. So we're the face to the world for all of these collections, which is the world's largest collection of Oregon plant specimens, preserved specimens. And so this is also where, through tools on our platform, is also how the collections are managed. So we have a good partnership with the herbarium. We have some tutorials and guides, both YouTube and written text, for using these various tools and their applications. And again, one thing to really stress is that our website is a flora. It is the digital version, an interactive digital version of the flora. And we've taken a lot of effort to make this engaging, to make it attractive, and to make it very user-friendly. But believe me, all of these data and all of the information that you find here is rigorous and scholarly work. So this isn't just pulling images, scraping images off of Google. This has been curated and is based in sound taxonomic research. And it also allows us to keep it up to date. So you can find updates, any sort of errata, and changes that have occurred through taxonomic research or new discoveries that have been happening since our paper books were printed. So one other thing I wanted to point out that's relevant to invasive species is that we do have an app. And in our app, it actually covers we're up to about 1,250 or 1,280 species of wildflowers on the app right now. And we do list for those instances the state listed invasive species, whether it's a list A or B or a T listing, that help people because they're going to encounter these things across the state. This is one way we can also share that information. So I think with that, I will just go back to the presentation and just sort of wrap up. We are here now. And yeah, so these are some of the people that make up our team. We are based physically at Oregon State University, and we are a completely independently funded organization. So that means that we're at the university, all of our salaries, our health insurance, our website expenses come from grants and donations. So if some of these tools prove useful for you, we enjoy your support and your participation. So I'd be happy to answer any questions and share that with Eve. Thanks very much.
Great. Thank you so much, Linda. That was really fantastic. So we do have some questions rolling in. One is asking specifically if British Columbia has any similar project underway, but maybe you could also speak more generally about, for folks outside of Oregon, do you know of any of these kinds of resources that might be available?
The New England, I'm not sure the exact name. I don't know if it's called Go Natives or gonatives.org, gobotany.org. That is a really great digital resource too that's sharing plant distribution data, image data, lots of tools. So that's another great one that that we admire. California has a combination of websites, and CalFlora, which is a nonprofit. They draw information from many of the resources, such as the Jepson Manual and the eFlora of California. And so that's another good example. Washington State has some of the tools through their Pacific Northwest Herbarium Consortium and through the Burke Museum. Oregon Flora is part of the Symbiota, uses a Symbiota platform. And so we're part of the Symbiota network that shares natural history collections data. And there are a number of other Symbiota portals. A very large one is SciNet, which is a lot of the Southwestern institutions. And there's also Torch, which is Texas and some of the Southeast universities and herbaria.
Great, thanks, Linda. And then also a few folks have messaged to us a note about eFlora out of British Columbia. And right. So I did add that link there into the chat for everyone to access. All right, Linda, also, so what do you think are some of the biggest barriers for people in getting native plants into their gardens or yards or landscaping? Is there a financial barrier, do you think? Do you think it's just an educational barrier? Kind of, what do you think are the biggest factors at play?
I think the first is access to reliable materials. And that's where we are working to help. And I think Eve raised some of the really good questions and issues about, how can you be sure you're really looking at a native plant? And that's where a flora and the information from the flora can support that. And hopefully the tools that we're developing to work with businesses can also assist that. So when I do believe when growers and vendors, they want to do the right thing. I'm hoping they want to do the right thing. And so these are resources that will help them to do that. native plants, as Eve mentioned, they're a hyper local industry, and it supports local economies. You know, if you want to sell plants for Eastern Oregon, you're going to do best if you are a nursery establishing, gathering seed, propagating these plants in Eastern Oregon. So it supports small economies. It also is regionally based. So that's a big help in that too. As far as I know, the Oregon Department of Ag does not have a native plant certification system for the commercial sale of native species. I hear some talk, and that's something that we would certainly be able to contribute to should that develop.
Great, thanks so much. Well, we are right at 2 o'clock now, so we will go ahead and wrap up. I want to thank Linda and Eve again so much for coming to speak as part of our Northwest Risk webinar series. And also thank you to Darcy for running our tech behind the scenes here. We will, once it's available in the next little bit, send out a recording from this webinar for everyone. And then we'll also compile all of the links from the chat so that, you know, in case you haven't been able to copy all of those, that you'll have access to those links and resources. Thank you all again so much for attending. We're really glad you could be here, and stay tuned to, you know, the Northwest Risk listserv, and you'll hear more about our events in the future. All right, thanks again. Bye, everyone.
Bye.